Everybody is doing well, as y'all can tell. I've been coming at you from the phone, but I'll get to the live computer and all of that once we get started and all in that space. But definitely, it is a wonderful day here in Durham, North Carolina, even though the weather has switched back and all along those lines, because we had a few days where the temperatures were around the 70s or the 80s, and I was thoroughly enjoying that. But now we're back into those temperatures that are closer to 91. And I think that even though the 4th of July and the Eno Festival is about to start, we're about to hit those hundreds. Well, at least those feel like hundreds. And I think that that's supposed to last for another week or two and all along those lines. So it ought to be quite fascinating to see what goes on in that space and whether we stay in this heat zone for a while and all along those lines. And of course, a lot of people are paying attention to sports news. I saw a recent interview where one of my folks that went to the same school that I did, Marquette, is going to be going back home to an area that is also known for being hot, that being Phoenix and everything. So definitely Oso Ighodaro is heading back to his home state, and he was saying that he had run a lot of NBA type plays when he was at Marquette, so he should be used to their system and all along those lines, and he thinks that he can help them tremendously and all in that kind of way. And of course, a lot of people are also paying attention to what's going on in the politics. Some people are wondering if Biden will be dropping out and whether we will have a Trump versus somebody else kind of campaign or what's going to be going on in that space and along those lines. But it ought to be quite fascinating to see what goes on in that way and what happens in this kind of regard. So, like I said, I've got some amazing gentlemen with me. So, you know, it's the online dinner party. And sometimes we have a variety of guests, and it looks like today's going to be the guys talking and all on those lines. But there may be some women join us later on. But we've had different shows with the online dinner party with different guests, because the way I always vision this was the way that I vision my folks when they used to do their bid whiz parties when I was a youngster. And a couple of days ago, I hit that big 6-2. So I just remember them having some good conversations, including some topics that you're not supposed to talk about on the dinner table. But their friends were activists and involved in politics and education. So yeah, they might talk about a little bit of anything. There might be talk about politics. There might be talk about sports. There might be talk about what their favorite TV shows were, and a whole lot of trash talking as well. Because like I said, they were playing bid whiz and they were playing things along those lines. So you know they had to have a lot of trash talking going on, as that was the game of choice. And while I live in an apartment now, I imagine if I was not in the single lanes and if I was living in a house, if I just invited various friends in and we had a conversation, that is what an online dinner party would be like and all along those lines. So definitely looking forward to this conversation. I'll bring in a fellow Mark, even though I think he did wrong. He spelled his name the other way and all along those lines. But hey, that's okay. We all can't spell it with a C and everything along those lines. But he is an author. He's coming at me from France and all in that kind of way. So I'm definitely interested in learning more about what he's got going on. And like I said, I'm gonna try to adjust the main computer so I can get in the way that I'm more comfortable and all along those lines. But Mark, if you'll share a little bit about yourself. Like I said earlier, we were talking and you were telling me that you are over there in the south of France. And even I was thinking about the Olympics, and you were saying that maybe some people are avoiding France because of the Olympics. But I do know that some people are heading that way, because I know Simone Biles, who is a gymnast, is already qualified and she'll be there in her third Olympics. I think that one of the track stars, Miss Richardson and everything, will not be there because I think that she didn't qualify, and there might have been some things that she was involved with as well that caused her not to qualify and all along those lines. But she'll be there, and maybe even some of these college basketball players will be there as well, even though there was some conversations here in the United States about Caitlin Clark not being picked for the Olympic team and all along those lines. So if you just share a little bit about yourself, and like I said, I'll try to get the main computer up and running, and we've also got Jack Lawrence and Dan with us as well. But definitely if you'll share a little bit about what you've got going on in your life, because I know you're an author and you've even done some amazing things, including living in France, even though I think you were born here in the United States.
Yeah. So I was raised in Ridgewood, New Jersey, which is about 20 miles outside of New York City. So I say it's 20 minutes or 20 hours, depending on traffic. So, but it was a lovely suburb with a great educational system and a lovely town. I grew up with 5 siblings. I've got 2 older brothers, 2 older sisters, 1 younger sister. And my parents both worked full time. My dad was a chemist, and my mother was a proofreader for the largest newspaper in New Jersey at the time, the Bergen Record. Then I started slowly moving out west. I went to the Ohio State University and got a degree in industrial design. And I grew up in a very creative household. My mother was really into the arts. And so we all performed with the ballet as children. And my sisters kept with it longer, and so did my older brother. But I retired around age 10 and focused on going to college. Actually, for medical school was the original plan. Then I switched over to industrial design. And then I caught the acting bug. After retiring from the ballet, I still love to perform and do some creative things. And so I moved out to Hollywood in 1984 and started acting and studying acting. And less than 2 years after moving out there and studying and working my tail off to become a good actor, I got cast on Hill Street Blues, which was one of my goals. And so I had a pretty good career. I stayed out there for 28 years, and in between the jobs, I started. I started 5 nonprofit companies, and though none were intended to be nonprofit, but
Wow.
so I learned a lot from failure, and I had a pretty adventurous life. So I kept trying new things and gave it my all. And then if it didn't work out, then I moved on to the next thing. And so. In 2011, my life changed. I was a carefree bachelor living in Los Angeles, and no children, never married, and a snack food business. That was my latest enterprise at the time. And then in 2011, I got a call from my brother saying that our mother, who was living in the home we all grew up in, just shut down and seemed to be on her way out. So he called the doctor, and she cut off all meds and food and said she's going, so call hospice. And hospice came in, and we all flew in the next morning, and we were on death watch pretty much.
Wow.
Priest came in and delivered the last rites, and so we thought that was it. So that's and then that's how the story in my memoir, A Cup of Tea on the Commode, began.
Well, yeah. Well, one, I love the title and that, and I definitely want to learn more of how you came up with that title. As you can see, I got to the correct computer and all along those lines. I actually know Bergen County a little bit and everything because I had a aunt that passed away not that long ago of MS and everything, but she was actually in New Jersey. She was actually involved in education. I want to say both in Newark and definitely in Sparta and all along those lines. And I had a cousin that now lives, I think he spends his time between Georgia and Atlanta, but he used to spend some time when he was younger in Asbury Park. So definitely I know some of those areas around New Jersey, including Bergen and all along those lines. But when I first heard about you and I heard this title of the book, I'm going like, yeah, I know a lot of people that will grab whatever they can, whether it's a cup of coffee or maybe even a book or a magazine, as they are spending time on a part of the house, whether you're in an apartment or a house that we all have to spend at least some moments in and all along those lines. So I really was curious about this title of the book and how the title came about and what made you think of that title.
Well, after this event with my mother, she no longer walked. So she was bedridden, and getting her in and out of the bathroom in her house that was built in the 30s, the doorways were pretty narrow, was a little dicey. So we set up a commode bedside, and sometimes Mother Nature took a little longer than was comfortable for either one of us. At this point, I was her 24/7 caregiver, and her favorite beverage was a cup of hot tea, skim milk, no sugar. And one morning when things were taking a little long, I asked her if she'd like a cup of hot tea, and she said yes. And so she was, it was a hit, and she was multitasking, and it became, I think, a pretty good title for the book. It seems to resonate with people, and they get a kick out of it. So,
No,
and also as a practical, a reason behind it.
No, I love that, and definitely has a practical reason. And before we get to some of the other gentlemen that are guests on this particular online dinner party, you mentioned a show that you were part of because you had that time in Hollywood and everything. And I do remember Hill Street Blues was actually one of those shows that I enjoyed watching back in the day. And even today, I will sometimes watch some of the current crime shows that are popular and some that have stayed popular and all along those lines. So definitely, whether it be Law and Order, the various variations of Law and Order, or whether it be Criminal Mind, or whether it be some of the other shows, including Blue Bloods. I have definitely been a fan of law enforcement type shows. And ironically, I have a cousin that is a GBI officer down in Georgia, meaning Georgia Bureau of Investigation. And a lot of the things that we see on those shows, some of them seem realistic. Some of them are definitely for Hollywood purposes and all along those lines. So I was just wondering, how much were you in? What can you say that you learned from that time on the show? Which role did you play, and how much did you enjoy being part of that definitely Hollywood legacy in terms of law enforcement type shows?
Well, that particular show at the time, it was one of the top rated shows. And so I was just thrilled to get on it, because once you get on a show like that, it kind of elevates your status among all the casting people and the I guess the movers and shakers and stuff like that. So it was a good credit to begin with. What was fun on that show, so I played Assistant DA Simmons. I was only in one episode, but what was fun about that is when you're a union actor and you go overtime, you get to the 8-hour period, and then things really start multiplying, which was lovely. So my first show went into, I think it was like double or triple golden time. So I made really good money, and I thought, oh, I've got this Hollywood thing set. This is fine. And then, of course, I didn't work for 7 months, which is typical. But in the courtroom, there was, you have people sitting in the courtroom as extras. And so it was a long day. It was over 11 hours. And there was a gentleman probably in his 80s that was just having the best time. And so after a number of hours late into the evening, I sat with him because I was curious. I said, don't you have something better to do at your age? And he says, oh, no, I love being on these sets and watching you young people work. It gives me energy. I just enjoy it so much. And he says, and my daughter owns this studio. And I said, really? Who's your daughter? His daughter was Mary Tyler Moore.
Oh, wow.
And so this gentleman would go from set to set. At that point, St. Elsewhere was also being filmed, a very high quality show on that lot. And then later on, Seinfeld was filmed on that lot. And so I had a really good reputation for really good shows. And it was just so fun that this man said, yeah, this is my kid's place. So I like to hang out with, where my kid is.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, hanging out where your kid is. You had earlier, when we were first on, and like I said, get ready to bring the other gentleman on later and everything, but you had mentioned this notion of where you are now, which is in the south of France, and you're talking about how laid back the south of France is. And I know you lived in 2 other areas that aren't necessarily all the time laid back, because I've even had friends of mine that tell me I have a New York style personality. I'm not sure what that means and everything along those lines. And then I've definitely got friends that are from California and all along those lines, even though I've never been out to the West Coast, even though I have friends in the acting profession, including a longtime friend that created the film This Christmas and everything along those lines. I like to think of that as the African-American version of Home Alone and all along those lines. But Ronnie Warner is a longtime friend from North Carolina and everything. But I was wondering if you could share with our audience a little bit about your perception of what's going on in France and how they are maybe a little bit more laid back. There's always this stereotype about Frenchmen being a little bit rude, and I would say that I've not always seen that experience and everything, but I was just wondering your experiences in France and how you've observed, because you can tell me how the grocery stores close at like 12:30. I'm going like, wait a minute, you mean if I want to get some food after 12:30, it might be difficult on a Sunday and everything, but I just wondering how you adjusted to that.
Well, you have to, if you're moving, like I said, I'm a pretty adventurous guy. So I moved here without really knowing all that much. I did some research. I came to visit this town in 2015, and it's a lovely town. It's called Pézenas. It's about 8,400 people. And my apartment was built about 500 years ago. So it's 16th century, 17th century, all over this village, cobblestone streets. They say Molière was born here. So it's a very theatrical town, but they've got artisans of all kinds. So it's very creative, artsy place, but also has a lot of political history too. So it's lovely. And if you're in the Southwest, it is what they say is the real south of France, where you have Provence, which has really been, a lot of the multimillionaires and stuff hang out there with the the big castles and the villas and all that business. The south of France in the west it's wine country. The people are really down to earth. And this particular village, they closed down the train station maybe in the 18th century. And they said that helped preserve this village because a lot of other villages around this area have been modernized. And this one has not. I mean, of course, we have water and I've got fiber, Wi-Fi and all that business. But with the cobblestone streets and the stone buildings, and it is just lovely. And most of the people here, they apologize for their bad English. My French is still terrible, and it'll probably always be terrible. But they're just lovely. And if you have an open mind and an open heart, and certainly accept that you are a visitor, an immigrant, that changes everything. So once you accept that, the ugly American does exist. You'll hear that tone sometimes, but even in France, they say that there's Paris and then there's the rest of France. So Paris is where you get those snobby people. I've run into them very rarely because, again, I think I approach it in the right way with a smile and just I'm like on vacation every day here. And I think if you approach people with that attitude, it's hard for them to be snobby. So
that makes a lot of sense. As I bring in Jack, and like I said, I'm bringing in Dan very shortly as well and everything. But is there a particular wine that you are a big fan of and all along those lines? Because you mentioned that it is wine country. And I know that even here we've got certain small wine companies that are having some success. So one of my friends is actually involved with a company called Shoe Crazy, and she actually started that after a auto accident, and she was trying to figure out something to get into. So she got into the whole wine business locally and everything, because her company is up in Virginia, even though they distribute it throughout the country, and they may be distributed internationally for all I know and everything. But I was just wondering, was there any particular wines that are your favorites that are there in the south of France?
Anything French. It's hard to find a bad wine here. I mean, I favor red wine, so I have red wine with every meal. They usually say white with fish and chicken. No, I'm a red guy, and there's so many domains here. I have a joke. I say if you throw a grape, you hit a wine domain, and if you want to, you can visit all the winemakers. And it's lovely because they love to talk about their wine and their process. And there's also a lot of, they call it bio here as opposed to organic, bio domains here and stuff like that. So they're interested in the quality, and they're interested in preserving the soil. And what they do is they have, and I think this was, I'm not sure exactly when it started, but in France, you have your wineries, and it's hectares here, not acres, but let's say acres of groves of the vines. And after a certain period of time, they've got to knock all those vines down and keep it dormant for at least 5 years to let the earth replenish. And I think at first a lot of the winemakers didn't like that because that's their money, and they had to cut out a good portion of their vines from time to time. But it is, I mean, they go for the quality, and they really want to help the earth, and they know how to do it. So they're doing something right. So I go with it. So it's nice, but you'll see in this area, it's ridiculous. It's just vines everywhere. But then you'll see a dormant field here and there. That's just grass, and it's just waiting. In 5 years, and then they start planting the vines, and I've seen it when they start all over again. So you have these little teeny vines, and within a couple of years, they're producing grapes, and it's lovely.
Yeah. How much of an adjustment was it for you when you moved there? Because one of the things we were talking about before we started the show was this notion of things shutting down on Sunday. I kind of alluded to that earlier, and definitely it seems like there are definitely some slowdown periods. I'm guessing even during the day. I know that there's the stereotype, and actually one of our co-founders here of the network is thinking about moving to Spain, which is next door to France and everything. Yep. And he's found it very lovely in that part of the world and everything. But I just wonder how much of an adjustment was it for you when you moved there? Because both New York and California, like I said, I've not been to California, but I've definitely been to New York and DC. They can be very fast paced and very much people trying to work 24/7, and in some cases maybe even 28/7, even though there's only 24
Yep.
hours in the
Yep.
day and everything. So I was just wondering, how did you adjust to that even as an actor? Because actors sometimes are having crazy hours.
Well, growing up in New Jersey and stuff, patience is not a virtue. But here you have to learn to really, you calm down. And their quality of life, they've got it right. So they take their 2-hour lunches every day, which is lovely because the kids come home from school and have a family meal with the folks. On Sunday, everything is closed after 12:30. Except for the boulangeries. I think they stay open a little longer. And I think a pharmacy, at least a pharmacy in every village, if they have one, stays open. But the grocery stores are closed after 12:30. During the week, the grocery stores are all closed after 7:30, which again is lovely. So the evenings, the town I live in is pretty much a tourist town. So in the spring and the summers, some of the stores are allowed to, not grocery stores, but the merchants here, so the clothing stores and the artisans, those little stores are allowed to stay open a little bit later. But it's lovely. And then the healthcare system here is amazing. The price of medicine and to visit the doctors and all that, they really care about health. They want to keep you healthy, and it's more preventative care. As opposed to being a money-making thing in the States. So that adjustment is a pleasant adjustment. The drivers here are insane. I'll say that's the one thing. There's a joke saying if you want a Frenchman to do something fast, stick him in a car. Doesn't matter, young, old, male, female, they're all right on your tail. They cannot wait to get somewhere, and they all speed. And they will pass you even in the parking lot if they can. And I don't know if a French person ever gets a ticket. I've gotten when I first came here, I got a couple tickets on the auto route, but I've never seen a French car get stopped. It's amazing. But so once you get I think if you get a car and you're here, you remove your rear view mirror so you don't have to worry about what's behind you, because it's annoying and scary because they don't know safe distance, which is a shame. I used to teach a comedy driving school when I was out in LA, and safe distance is not a concept they understand. So
yeah, it makes a lot of sense and everything. Hey, Jack, I know you're a fellow author and all along those lines. Like I said, I'll bring in Dan as well. You've been hearing some of this conversation, and part of it is something that I talk about quite a bit on the Online Dinner Party, which is this notion of work-life balance. So if you want to share a little bit about your book as well, and maybe even what its topic is, because I know that you are a fellow author along with Mark Poirot and everything. So if you want to share a little bit about your book and what you're all about.
Yeah, so I started off in the mental health field, and then I was fortunate enough to sell my practice, and it gave me a lot of free time to kind of sit down and write. And so I wrote a book that it's a mystery that was floating around in my head for about 4 years, and just never really had the time to actually sit and write it. So after I sold my practice, I did just that, and was very fortunate for it to get in the hands of the right people at the right time, and it became a bestseller and won an award. And so I decided to stick the writing thing out for a little bit longer, and next thing I know, a year later, I've got 4 bestsellers, and things are continuing to move in all the right directions. So kind of one of those things where the stars just aligned, and I decided to roll with it.
What advice would you give to people? And this is actually for both of you that are thinking about writing a book. I've had people that have told me about different things that I've shared on this show and other shows about my family legacy and family history. And they've been like, well, when are you writing your book? And I'm like, well, I haven't gotten around to it yet, even though a lot of the content is probably in these podcasts if I was actually to dig through them and everything. But you actually had a successful practice in terms of health and everything. So what advice would you give to folks that are thinking about writing a book? And should you try to write a bestseller, or should you just write what you are passionate about? So, Jack, what would your advice be for those that are thinking about writing a book, and should they figure out a genre? Because you mentioned your books are in that mystery genre.
I think genre kind of figures itself out once you start writing. People tend to kind of go towards whatever genre they're most interested in anyway. So I think that part kind of figures itself out. When it comes to what to do, my best advice is to just sit down and start typing. When I wrote Bloodthorn, which was my first book, my one and only goal was to maybe have one person buy it and think it was okay. If they didn't hate it and they thought it was an all right book, I was going to be completely happy with that. And it wasn't until it started kind of taking a life of its own that I decided to continue writing. But every book, the process is always the same. I get the idea and I sit down and write. That's where the editors and the beta readers and all of those things step in after the fact. They'll clean it up. They'll tell you what you can do better or where the story needs to go and things like that. But a lot of people get hung up with the paralysis by analysis, right? They start thinking about all the things that they need to do and they want the book to be perfect and all of these things. But if you just sit down and write the first draft, get that out of there, then you can always clean it up. You can make it pretty. But if you're stuck and you're writing a book for 5-6 years, then by the time you get to that end point, that book is going to need to be a completely different book, right? Because you're a completely different person at that point. So I say just sit down and start typing and see where it goes.
That makes a lot of sense. Along those same lines, I definitely want to hear Mark's answer, and I will bring in Dan as well as everything. But do you think that some authors are so busy, particularly if they're in a certain genre, because as we mentioned earlier in this show, Mark came from that Hollywood kind of background and everything, that they are wanting the book to be picked up by a movie studio or picked up by somebody that'll make it a bigger platform. So was that something that you thought about, even Mark, even Jack, when you wrote your book and everything, the notion that it could become a Hollywood movie? And has there been any interest from Hollywood in any of your books and everything? Or is that something that was even in the back of your mind?
So it wasn't, but then as you start writing them and you start learning the characters and the stories become more developed, more recently it's been something I've been considering. Not necessarily Hollywood specifically, but I've been talking to local independent filmmakers and kind of picking their brains, seeing what they think, what media would be best, right? Whether it's a series or a film. Somebody I spoke to yesterday who has been in Hollywood and written scripts, they're going to be giving me some pointers on starting a script. So I think at the end of the day, it would always be cool. I think it's one of our fantasies to see our work, on the screen. That's the ultimate goal. But for me, as long as I'm writing, I'm happy. And if somebody wanted to make a movie of it, I certainly wouldn't tell them no.
Mm-hmm. What's your take on that, Mark, and everything? Because you did have that experience of having been in Hollywood, like you said, that one episode where you're on Hill Street Blues, but I'm sure you're on a number of other shows as well during your time in Hollywood. But I was wondering, what advice would you give to folks that are thinking about writing and wanting to go into this whole notion of turning their movie or their comic book or whatever into a Hollywood production?
Well, those are big questions. I'd say, right. Again, like Jack said, just start writing and write what you're passionate about, because it's a long slog. And don't worry. Again, just get that first thing out. They call it the vomit draft. Don't worry about it. Just get the story out of your head, and then you can start worrying about structure and fine tuning it and stuff like that. So. It's, mine, I wasn't expecting to write a book. I write, this book was a memoir. I used to do stand-ups. So I wrote jokes and scenes and stuff in Hollywood and screenplays, and then had one short film produced, which is funny, Mark, because you're talking about it's a parody on Law and Order. When Law and Order SVU came out, everybody called it SUV. And one of my friends is the executive producer on that. So I said, wouldn't it be funny if the entire show was shot inside an SUV? And so I wrote a parody where the murder, the investigation, and the courtroom scene all takes place inside an SUV. I had a big SUV at the time, so it was it's kind of fun. It's on YouTube still. We did this back, I think, in 2006, called Law and Order Sport Utility Vehicle. It was funny, and it won an award at I think the Houston International Film Festival way back when. So when I write, at least when I planned on writing this one, I didn't think about a movie or anything at the time. I was just taking notes because I like to record family history in one way or another. And so I didn't know how long I was going to have taking care of my mom. So I took notes, a lot of photographs, and a lot of videos, because when you're doing this 24/7 care, there's just some conversations and moments that were just really, really special that I didn't want the other, my siblings to miss out on. So I wanted to record those so they could experience those as well. And while I was doing it, I had friends who were just starting or about to take care of their own folks. And so I shared some of my experience, and they seemed to get some benefit out of it. And so I said, I think I got something here, and I think a book is going to be the best way. But I didn't know memoir, so I had to study that genre, because that was a whole new thing. So I studied the genre for a while, and a couple of years later, here we go. So I got a publisher, which was pretty cool. After 60, I found a publisher that really resonated with it, and the story is a lot of humor in it. And again, like what Jack said, you just start writing. I had no idea. I wrote chronologically what our event was, which was a 3.5-year journey. But then all these flashbacks of my childhood that seemed to support what was going on in the current time frame made sense. And so structurally, when you had, let's say, a current event, and there was something in my past that helped support that. So structurally, that's what I did. So I threw in some flashbacks, either before or after a particular chapter, that helped make more sense of that chapter and why the actions were taken either by me or my mother or another sibling or my father or something like that. So that's what the publishers and the editors with the publishers really helped out with. The structure was probably my most difficult thing. Dialogue and stuff was no problem for me from my screenwriting experience and stuff like that. So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Jack brought up something else, and I'm going to bring in our final guest. At least I think it's the final one for the day and everything. But this whole notion of analysis by paralysis, because I do know that is something that we talked about a lot on this show and other shows as well and everything, because I do know that I've been guilty of it. Some people call it the imposter syndrome. Some people call it the inner critic, that has various names that people will give it and everything. So I was just wondering, I definitely want Dan to introduce himself as well, but our thoughts around that, because on several of these shows here on Pod TV, it has come up, particularly on the shows that I am part of and everything. And I will admit that just recently celebrated a birthday and hit one of those magic numbers within the 6 number. So it's actually 62 and everything along those lines. And I know that it was still in the bachelor space, and I know that there have been women that I have not pursued and careers that I have not pursued because I was too busy analyzing what was going on and finding reasons not to do it. And by the time I got to it, it was too late. Somebody had stepped in the case of relationships, or somebody had stepped in the case of jobs as well. So I just wanted y'all's thoughts as to how y'all avoided that analysis paralysis, because I think that is something that is very common for a lot of us and everything along those lines. And then I definitely want Dan to introduce himself as well. But for the two gentlemen that have already been in conversation, then we'll have Dan introduce himself. How have you dealt with that analysis paralysis?
Jack, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think my work in the mental health field helped a lot. So before that, in my early 20s, kind of similar to Mark, I had a few businesses that, unfortunately ended up being nonprofit. So failure, it wasn't ever anything that really bothered me. In fact, I found it as a learning tool, something I could take into the next thing. And then working in the mental health field and being a therapist, people get mad. There's a lot of emotions, and they'll say anything to you, right? If you strike the wrong nerve, or they're trying to avoid whatever is coming up in therapy. And so the criticism, I've learned not to take anything personal, right? It's very rarely actually geared toward you. And so I came to the conclusion throughout that process in my career that either people are going to like it or they're not. And if they're not, that's completely fine, because maybe somebody will. And fortunately enough for me, it turned out a lot of people did. But if they don't, then that's fine. At the end of the day, I have to answer to myself, my family, and the things that I'm responsible for within kind of my bubble. And so that's what I write for. That's what I strive to find pleasure in, and the outside voices aren't as important anymore. So if I'm not happy with it, then I change it. Right? If there's something in the book that I think's not good, I'll delete it, or my editor will tell me it's not good, and I'll change it. So I think I was very fortunate to have a career in mental health that prepared me for some criticism and how to not be bothered by it.
That makes a lot of sense. What about yourself, Mark? How did you deal with that inner critic and everything? I'm sure there was even people that were telling you, well, wait a minute, you lived both when you made the move from the northeast to the west coast. There were probably people that were telling you all the reasons that you shouldn't go to Hollywood. And I'm sure when you told people you're ready to move to a whole other country, they were going like, no, don't do that. There's no reason to go there and everything. So how have you dealt with those?
Well, you definitely develop a thick skin in Hollywood, but I was a designer before that, and that's all. You have critics on everything you do, whether it's a brochure or logo or something like that. And if it's good, it's good. If you feel it's good, and certainly if your team feel it's good, you put it out there, and you really don't have any power once it goes out into the world. And so. But again, be open. I mean, if you have a lot of people saying that they have an issue with it, you have to maybe look at that. I think when the publisher eventually signed with, they said, we like your voice, we like the story, we think it has a lot of potential, but we have notes. And I said, great, give me the notes. And that was kind of a test. They wanted to see if I was going to be open to the notes. And the notes were very good. So I did a rewrite, a few weeks later, I resubmitted it, and they said, we like it. Let's move forward. Again, especially with me, it was my first book. So I was going to be totally open to criticism, not from people who don't know what they're talking about, which we find a lot of those. But, when you're doing stand-up out in Hollywood, you get the critics right away, and you got to deal with it. And so, I would call it the perfection syndrome, and that can really hold you back. And I have a little bit of that, but I have a pretty good gauge of, I think what Jack said, if you feel it's good, and then you certainly get that support from your team, you keep going. But let's say the book was released on Mother's Day last year, and then a few months later I did the audio book. And when I did the audio book, I did some rewriting because I saw things that it didn't sound right, or made any corrections, or things that I wish I changed before it went out to print and stuff like that. So there's always those things. And I also have made notes since, if I do a release sometime in the future annotated version, Anthony Bourdain, in his book Kitchen Confidential, a few years later, he did a annotated thing where he had hand notes where he reconsidered things. He goes, that guy really wasn't such a bad guy, or that recipe really kind of sucked, and I should have really revised that and stuff like that. So there's some fun things where you get you rethink and you correct. And I had a sister who told me that I got her college major incorrect. It wasn't dance, it was dance education. So in the audio book, that was fixed, and that'll be fixed in any future things or something. So it's not a big deal. You get over it and get on with it. You want to get the book out, and then you can always do that stuff in a revised version or something like that.
Yeah, and sometimes people probably pay closer attention to that than they are expected and everything. Because you mentioned, because I do have some, actually my dad's girlfriend is involved in dance and all along those lines. But that being said, and they've been together even longer than my parents were together and everything. But she was a dance critic and a dancer. But sometimes people are thinking things that are related, but maybe they want you to be more specific, because the fact that she wasn't a dancer but a dance educator, she was going like, wait a minute, that's not the same thing. And some people might say that that was your sister being petty and everything, but I can see where there would be a differentiation that you want to make if you're an educator versus that's into.
But her response to me was, it's not a big deal, but if you have a chance to fix it sometime in the future, do it. And I said, okay, I will.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It was like she was just basically telling you that it wasn't going to make or break her love for you, and all along those lines and everything. Hey, Dan, if you'll share a little bit about your background as well, that's kind of what the dinner party is. We get to know each other, have casual conversation, and all along those lines. So if you'll share a little bit about your own journey and some of the things that you've been hearing in this particular conversation.
Well, Mark Lee, thank you so much. And Mark Steven and Jack, it's nice to meet both of you as well. I'm here in Cleveland, Ohio, and this has been home since 1972. I grew up in eastern Ohio coal country and steel mine country along the Ohio River. So you can place that. That's on the, I say, the northern tip of Appalachia. So that's really where I hail from. And so my trajectory, I guess, was, I grew up thinking I wanted to become a preacher. And I ended up becoming an interfaith minister, several years later. But that's what I thought I was going to do in life, and discovered that I was much too sinful to do that. And so I decided to just, follow my curiosity through life. And so I hopped on a Greyhound bus the week after I graduated St. Clairsville High School, and went off to Tucson, Arizona, and set aside the plans to go to a seminary, and decided to have a good time out there, and nearly flunked out of the U of A because I was having too much fun. And there was this place called Rock Point on the Baja that we spent way too much time. But, it was a great thing, and I needed to do it. But bringing it back to the present, because that was kind of the breaking point. Throughout my life, there's been, certain transitional events that have kind of defined my path. And so, but today, I'm primarily a writer, and I teach graduate business students at Transcontinental University, which is a European Union university. All of my students are elsewhere, not in the U.S. So I just finished a doctoral dissertation student with Andrews from Ghana, and it was the most amazing experience that I think I have ever had, because I learned so much. And Andrew is just a great teacher. But when we were talking about writing, this guy was over the top in terms of his quantitative skills. But, he really needed to learn a lot about writing. So it took him 2.5 years to finish his dissertation. But this guy is a lovely human being. And I have to tell you, I think of all the people that I've met in my life, I've never seen a more beautiful smile and a more beautiful human being. But I enjoy teaching. I, spent 15 years at Cleveland State University. So, a lot of my writing was really, scholarly stuff, in a lot of ways, kind of heady and boring stuff, abstract, but I've always had an appetite for those things, and I love to teach. So what has brought my writing down to earth has been my teaching. And I think that's kind of a great way to think about, how you make your writing accessible. And I taught writing for about 5 or 6 years, mostly essay writing. And that, too, I learned a tremendous amount about. But I'm married. My wife, Mary, and I, we just celebrated our 34th wedding anniversary. We have 2 sons, and we have 3 grandsons. And so, that's a big part of our lives, and been blessed. And, you try to keep up with all the young folks, and that's what keeps you vital. So I'm 73, so I've tried to reinvent myself pretty regularly to make sure I can stay in touch with my inner child. And Jack, you can probably relate to that concept. Mm-hmm. It's important to renew ourselves, and that's something that I've learned. So my dad was a poet, and he worked as a millwright by day and wrote poetry early mornings. And I learned the art form of poetry from him. And I lost my dad in October 2008. But he said to me one day, my wife and I were at their house in Tupelo, Mississippi, and he said, Donnie, he said, I wish I had a book of poetry like you did. And I went, oh my God, the thought of trying to edit my dad's poetry book, I mean, this guy is meticulous, and he's had probably 25 poems that have been published in really highly recognized journals. And I thought, oh, this is going to be too hard. But it was the greatest bonding experience I ever had with my dad. And he died 7 months later. And so I've learned a lot by writing, by teaching. And now where I am is I have this book that comes out on July 8th, and it's called America's Dream at a Crossroad. And it basically looks at the American dream as a defining issue in this upcoming presidential election and beyond. As we all know, the American dream has been something that has varied by people, and when you look across our population, a lot of people are struggling to really reach the American dream in their own sense. So socioeconomic mobility is much more challenging. It's not challenging at all for the upper 1%, 10%, or 20%. And I don't bash prosperity and wealth building in the book. I think a lot of people have done that. But I decided we really needed a new approach, because if we do that, I think we're undermining, I lose a lot of people's attention by doing that. So I really talk about the shift from prosperity and wealth in terms of the American dream to well-being in a much more comprehensive sense. And Jack, one of the things that I learned in my interviews is that mental health is a huge issue. It's absolutely huge. And our healthcare system does so little to support it.
Yeah, I think there's still the cultural and societal stigma as well. Men in particular, there's still that kind of cultural fact that the men in general just don't do therapy. The younger generation, I think, is starting to. It's a little bit more accepted. But, yeah, I mean, businesses and companies, right, if they pay for mental health, it's usually 3 to 5 sessions. And one of those sessions is going to be your intake. So really you're getting 2 to 4 sessions. So, yeah, I definitely agree that the mental health field and kind of the approach to mental health needs a major revamp kind of across the board.
Jack, along those same lines and everything, I was just wondering and everything, because one thing that I've heard about one of the projects that I'm involved with, as y'all can tell, I'm probably involved in a multitude of them, but one of them is with a veterans organization, and we actually use the Apollo, meaning the Apollo Theater model. So we actually do a talent show that's been going on. I think this will be coming up on our 11th year. We do one this year and everything along those lines, but we use that same model with a Kiki Shepard and a house band and everything, and then they go up to the real Apollo. But part of the reason that Captain Newborn, ironically his first name and not his rank, because he never served in the military, is because he had a interest in veterans affairs, and part of that is also around mental health, because he oftentimes brings up how poorly we do with our veterans in terms of their mental health and everything. So I just wanted your take on that, because I know it comes up a lot on our shows. And like I said, they started at my cultural arts center that I work at, and then they have rotated around the state of North Carolina, and I think a couple of other states have picked it up as like a franchise opportunity and everything. But I just wanted your take on mental health and the importance of mental health, and why don't men do enough therapy and all along those lines.
Yeah, so I think the military is actually pretty good about encouraging its service members to get mental health. I mean, if they want it, it's completely free. The military and the government's going to pay for however many sessions it takes, basically. The VA, unfortunately, isn't always the best equipped to deal with it, as maybe the private sector is, but they'll still pay for private therapy. And I've had the fortune to work with a few service members, but the culture in the military is still very much so, if you have a problem, you deal with it, but it's not necessarily deal with it in the context of talk to somebody about it. And with men, I think it's still very much so kind of the same concept, right? The idea is that men need to be more compassionate. They need to be more in touch with their feelings and their emotions and discuss what's bothering them. But there's still that feeling. Talk about it with anybody but me, right? The idea is that nobody else really cares. It's my problem that I have to deal with. And so there's still that mindset among most men that if they have a problem or they're struggling with something, they need to suck it up and just deal with it, or push it down and let it run its course. And then, of course, military is predominantly male, so you add kind of those two factors together, and it shuts a lot of people down, and they oftentimes don't get the help that they deserve, because it's not even just the things that they see in the military, because a lot of times service members aren't necessarily going to war, but you're away from your family. You've got financial struggles just like anybody else. So there's a lot of other things that service members could certainly be dealing with in addition to anything that they've faced in the military. And so I think changing the idea and the perception that therapy somehow makes you weak, or that sharing your problems with other people is a problem, that would go a long way in getting people more comfortable with going to therapy in general. And I think that's probably where a big part of the stigma is that idea of just sucking it up and dealing with it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dan brought up a really interesting topic as well that kind of plays into it, but I was curious about everybody's thoughts around this and everything, because I'm of the opinion that sometimes our education system, and I brought it up, and definitely even some of the founders of the network have brought it up as well, that we squash that childlike wonder and everything along those lines. I don't have any children of my own, but I do have 2 nephews, and I know that even when they were first little ones, and they are now teenagers, because they'll be hitting 15 and 16 on this particular year next month in August and everything. But I remember when they were first born, my dad was showing them nature and all along those lines, and you had some people that were thinking that was too young in age to show them some of the wonders of life and everything, because of this notion that the brain isn't developed enough and all on those lines. I think my dad kind of went against that philosophy, and I think that was the right thing for him to do. And even now, I know that there are adults that don't want to engage in fun activities or game activities in life and everything. So I just wanted y'all take on that, because I think that sometimes we suppress, there are people that get into video games, but sometimes we do suppress childlike wonder as we get into corporate America and everything. So I just wanted everybody take on that, including the other Mark and everything. But what is our take on this notion that maybe we are suppressing too much our childlike wonder that we had when we were kids and everything?
Well, I'll jump in. So when I decided to take care of my mom, I asked for permission first. I said, "You want me to come move back and take care of you and make sure you're as happy as can be?" And she said yes. And so I said, "If I do this, we're going to have fun. We are going to have fun." And I had a goal that I didn't tell her, but I wanted to make her laugh at least once a day. Mm-hmm. And sometimes that was a challenge. But both of my parents had really good senses of humor. And so she made me laugh quite a bit also. But, I did things like I did the river dance. She was Irish, so I did the river dance to get her laughing. I got her laughing, but my shins were crying. But, you do that. If the goal is to make them laugh, you gotta, it's the price of art. You got to make those sacrifices. So I think both of my parents were pretty young at heart also, and that fortunately was passed on to their children and me as well. So I approach that now. I'm just having a ball here. I live in France, and it's like great, and I think some of the neighbors may call me the crazy American, because he's always happy and always having a good time, and that's the goal. My motto is find the joy. So whatever situation I go in, I look for the joy. And if you go in with that intent, you're gonna hit it most of the time. But it's certainly a better way to go than, oh, this is gonna really be terrible. So find the joy in any of those challenges and adventures, and I think it's a good way to go.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Dan, you were also involved in the care of your parent as well. So I was wondering, what similarities did you have to Mark Poirot and everything in terms of the way that you took care of your parents? Because I did hear you say that you had some parent care that you were doing as well.
Oh, you're talking about my younger years or
Yeah,
my?
your younger years. Right?
Yeah, well, I think my personal memoir talks a lot about that, and that's talk about a book that I had to write more times than I could even imagine. It went through 6 iterations because I tried to follow the rule that never write anything that you would live to regret, and yet be honest. And so, I had a hard time growing up because I grew up in a super religious household. I mentioned earlier that I wanted to be a preacher, and my mother always wanted me to do that. I think my dad was more open, but lots of restrictions. So I had a difficult time with my parents once I reached middle school and going into high school. It was a difficult time, and because of our differences in belief and just a lot of things that build up when there's a lot of distance, it makes for a hard relationship. Um, but I think that as I reflect back on my life, you were talking about childhood wonder, Mark, and I think that's an important thing not to stifle. But it's never too late to reignite it, and I think that that's an important thing for all of us to keep in mind. I spent a lot of time in nature as a child, as a boy, fishing, hiking, and doing all kinds of things. And it was just an amazing experience. I mean, because there's so many things that you do wonder about when you see. I can remember, lifting rocks and finding salamanders, under them, and wondering about these tiny like dinosaur creatures and where they came from, and why were they here? And so I think a lot about that. But when you think about resolving relationships, especially with people that are the closest to you than you can imagine, it takes time because they're built into you. And so it took a lot longer. My mom died of cancer when she was 59. She had pancreatic cancer and lived only 5 months. And I think for her, because she suffered, and Jack, I know just by some of the things you talked about with mental health, she struggled with mental health most of her life, and she really did. Ran in the family, and mostly anxiety issues. But I got a lot of that, and that's stuff that I had to work through. My dad, on the other hand, I'm convinced he might have been a Nazarene, but I think he was a Buddhist. In the sense that he took every day, one day at a time. He really did. That's why he was such a great millwright. He could get factory equipment back up and running, just systematically going through it, not worrying about it. He says, "I'll get it done. We'll get this thing up and running. This plant will open at 6:30 in the morning as it should." But my mother worried about whether the sun was going to come up in the morning. She did, and it was really sad. It was really sad. Um, but I have learned through life to actually use you know the obstacles and the problems I've had, and it turned them into opportunities. My poetry, and I've got 10 published books of poetry after my dad. Thanks, Dad. But it's been the ability to be an alchemist in the sense of taking something negative and turning it into a positive, or at least turning it into something that's meaningful. It doesn't have to be as simple as negative to positive. But I look at today's world, and we have so many challenges. When people, again, Jack, you probably know this just professionally, but you look around at people, they're suffering so much.
Hmm.
My wife and I worked 2 days a week at the Cleveland Clinic Cancer Institute. We just basically ended that contract, but this was a thing we did after a retirement for 2 days. We worked with cancer patients and their families. My wife is a Reiki therapist, and she provided Reiki, and it was just incredibly beneficial to patients. I did mindfulness meditation, journaling, and I did a little bit of spiritual care work. But we learned so much from that experience. But also, you see the suffering. So, on top of having, cancer, and all the things that introduces in life, there's a lot of other things that it triggers: the financial challenges, all the things that are put upon you, put upon your family, how people deal with issues like, you really feel guilty that you have cancer because, you're cheating your kids, your grandkids, your husband, your wife. And so all of these things. But I learned to use what I learned earlier on in life in terms of turning negatives into positives. I call it alchemy, to help patients. And I found that, coupling that with meditation and journaling was really very powerful. Um, we have plenty of psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers who worked with these patients on a regular basis, but I was freed up because I didn't have to stay within my disciplinary boundaries here of being a psychiatrist, but I could have meaningful encounters with patients, and we could talk about poetry, we could talk about their kids, and they really felt like they had some real person that they're talking to. And I think that was a great thing for both Mary and I to do that. We never anticipated that. It just happened. And once we were in it, we realized we really are blessed to do this work. But that's been a defining influence for us, too, as we think about our elder years and what we've learned and our ability to continue to give to others, which is really important to both of us. And we worked as a team, which is really, for a lot of people, they say, how could you possibly work with your spouse? I can't think of a better person to work with. I really can't. It's been unbelievable. But anyway, I don't want to capitalize on too much of the airtime here.
Yeah, that makes sense and everything.
Yeah.
But actually, as you were saying, a couple of things that were interesting and all along those lines, because I know one of the conversations that I've been having, and I had it with a couple of folks, is this notion, because one of the jobs that I do is working with a testing company, and it's the reason that I don't think as of yet that AI has caught up and everything, because AI is good on understanding certain things, but I don't know that it understands nuances. So the parallel that I have always used, coming back to childlike wonder, is that if you remember the old game, and we've all played it, if you look at a clouds and everything, we all remember trying to look at the clouds and try to imagine what we think the clouds look like, and all along those lines. And what I may look at the same clouds that all four of us may look at the same clouds and come up with a different answer because it's imagination and everything. So I may see a village in Italy, you may see a spaceship and everything, but we're looking at the same clouds, and that's where I think that AI doesn't quite have it together in terms of nuances and all along those lines, because it is going more for the hard facts, like 2 + 2 is going to be 4 and everything, but it's not going to get to the nuances as of yet. That doesn't mean that it won't get there at some point, but as of now, I don't think that it is there.
It will, Mark.
What did you say, Dan?
It will.
No, I think that eventually
emotional intelligence and the training of AI along those nuanced lines. So how do we know so much of this about, it's when you teach college students, they're going to use it, right? Mm-hmm. So the whole thing is we allow them, there are standards that they have to meet. They can use it to help them with research. They can't use it to write. We constantly have to update these AI detectors because, we just have to check them all. But I have to tell you something. We've seen a tremendous difference in people. You were talking about analysis paralysis. It's a great tool to overcome that. Mm-hmm. It is a great tool. And once you customize a relationship with AI, whether it's ChatGPT or whether it's Claude 3 or 4, whatever it is, there's potential there. Yeah. But the emotional side, the recognition of context is growing very rapidly. I wish I had just a small percent of the money that people are getting from, all these new developments in this field.
Yeah, they're definitely having some new developments and everything. You mentioned, I'd love to hear the other two gentlemen's thoughts about this, but it's this notion of, because it's come up on a couple of my shows, this notion of work-life balance and all along those lines. I know that I am not always the best at that, because sometimes I'll have multiple jobs and sometimes I'll have multiple things that I have to juggle and everything. So I was just wondering, how have you dealt with that work-life balance? It seems like, Jack, one of the things you did is you went from one job to another job, so that might be how you had the work-life balance. And maybe in Mark's case, it was literally going and moving to another country and everything. But how have you dealt with that work-life balance, and what advice do you give to people to maintain work-life balance? Or is it something we should even try to be having?
Yeah, for me, it was when I was doing therapy, I had a very clear boundary of what my hours were. And anything outside of those working hours, I was with my family, and I was not going to answer calls or text or emails. And if it was, an emergency, then there's numbers that are available. And then once I transitioned into writing, it was kind of similar where I have set writing hours that I try to stick to, but fortunately it's a much more flexible role, right? I can kind of write anytime I want to. So I don't necessarily adhere to those as much. And then when it comes to like events and things, I do make sure I schedule events around, kids' soccer games or gymnastic events, whatever they got going on. But for me, the family was always number one, because I remember growing up, my parents were at every single event, right? I never found myself looking up into the stands hoping to see my parents. I knew they were going to be there. And so I wanted that for my kids too. I never wanted them to grow up wondering if I was going to make it. So as soon as I started my therapy career and even my writing career, if there's something going on for them, then I'm going to be there, no questions asked. And I make sure to set aside a certain amount of time for them, every single day. Because the self-care and my hobbies outside of writing, fortunately, I have the luxury to kind of do when I want to, right? So, but even when I was doing therapy, private practice offered a lot of the same things, right? You'd have cancellations or openings in the schedule, and I could go run errands or go to the gym or anything I wanted to do during those times. But work-life balance has always been a priority for me. I never wanted to work myself into the ground. I wanted to live life, and work was just, things to do because I enjoyed what I did.
That makes a lot of sense. What about you, Mark? How did you deal with that work-life balance? Was it partially that move, or how did you deal with that?
Well, it's very different because I'm officially retired when I came to France. I'm not allowed to work here. I do rent my place, so I'm somewhat of a chambermaid. So when it's sometimes very busy, so then I move off and stay with my girlfriend, who lives about 15 minutes away. So sometimes being the chambermaid is, again, for me, it's a kick. I get a kick out of it, though. You have people living in your house, and sometimes when you open the door, you're not sure what you're going to find. But luckily, I've been very fortunate, and it's kind of an expensive place to stay at. So hopefully, I've got people who are a little bit more responsible. But when I was in the States, especially in the design business, it's crazy, and the work-life balance, there wasn't any. It's work to discipline yourself to try to have some balance, and sometimes it's difficult because I remember when I first started in the design business, I was doing probably at least 2 all-nighters a week. And I don't know if that ever stopped until I quit and moved to France. And then when you have your own business, when I had the snack business in LA, it was the same thing. It's just insane because it ended up being almost a one-man show. I built a factory and I designed the equipment around what I was doing. I called it the ballet because I just moved around the factory. I had it set up or it could work, but it was a crazy time because I wanted the thing to be successful. So you put, your heart and soul in it. And if you have orders that needed to be done, if you didn't have good workers, which it was really tough to find some good workers, I just took more and more on myself. So here it's very different. And I'll tell you, so when I first came here, to get I got a mortgage for this, but navigating the French financial system was not easy for an American, especially. And so I hired a broker, and the process was just taking forever. And as an American, we want answers and things like that. It took 17 months for me to buy this place.
Wow.
Negotiations and going through the bank and getting approvals, and then change. If you made any change in the contract as a company here, it took 6 to 8 weeks to get that revised, and just a lot of crazy stuff happened. And so I got really frustrated, but I didn't get angry with anybody because I didn't want to, jeopardize the process. But the broker at one point, I said, what is going on? He says, Mark, you got to understand something in France. If they have anything to do other than work, they do it. Don't take anything personally. This is their way of life. And once you understand that and accept it, they've got it right.
Along the same lines of having it right and everything, you said something, Mark, that was interesting, and it is something that gives me maybe a little bit of hope because our other guest, Dan, has said he's been in a long marriage, and like I said, I am still a bachelor in the early '60s, and you said a girlfriend. That means that there might still be hope for me in that sense, and all along those lines. So maybe there's hope for me to find a
There's
significant
always
other
hope.
even
There's
at the
always
age
hope.
of 62 and everything. So I don't know whether you were intending to find the girlfriend when you got to France, but maybe she's a French young lady, but you found a girlfriend there in France. So what advice do you give to those of us that are approaching what some people would consider middle age and everything that are still in those single lanes?
Well, you gotta focus. I didn't have any real plans other than moving here. But when you make a choice and I think you go in for the right reasons, the universe seems to help support that. It certainly did when I decided to move home and take care of my mom. And when I came to France, it's insane. I shouldn't be here. I didn't speak the language. I never thought about it. It was an ex-girlfriend who put this idea in my head. And she's the one that found this village. And once I decided to come here, I just said, this is what I'm going to do. And everything kind of fell into place. And it's just been lovely. So I call them my angels. I have angels, watching out for me that have really guided me, I think, throughout life. And again, part of it is just having a good attitude. And I got that from my folks. So
That makes a lot of sense and everything. Hey, Dan, along those same lines, and it kind of comes back to your current book and everything. I know a lot of people that will look at the housing market. They will look at a lot of other things. They'll even look, because we've talked about it on various shows here on the network, the division that's out there in the United States. And there are definitely polarizing figures. Some people would say that both candidates are polarizing figures and all along those lines. But I just wonder, is the American dream even alive and well? Because I know a lot of folks that have given up this notion of even having a house or a property, where that used to be the whole notion. And of course, there was that notion of the white picket fence and the impossibility, because I think it was 2.5 kids, and I'm figuring out what 0.5 is, because you can't really have half of a kid and everything. But I do know that was the statistics and everything along those lines. But I just wonder your take on the American dream and whether the American dream is still alive and well.
Well, I think most of the studies kind of are divided on that, Mark. Depends on who you ask. If you talk to the American Enterprise Institute, they'll say that the American dream is very much alive. If you talk to I don't know, the Economic Policy Institute in Washington, they'll say no, it's not. My own take on it is that the dream needs to be available to people in their own way. I think it needs to continue to be about prosperity and wealth building, but in a larger well-being sense. I think we need to advance it. That's why I said early on to Jack, I think mental health is huge. When you think about whether you're going to get there or not, we're stressed out, we're burdened by all these things that go on in our lives, but around our lives. So it's very difficult to manage. But I think we have not really looked at the American dream in a serious sense. And I really ask the question in the context of government's role in making that happen. And I'll admit, I am a moderate conservative, so my perspective probably aligns more to David Brooks from the New York Times than some other writers. But I think we need to recognize that just about everything government does has an impact on either propelling people along the path of reaching their dream or standing in the way of it. And I don't think we've ever used the dream as a centering concept. And I think that needs to be the case, an integrated concept for the election. And it's not an easy one, because a lot of people say, well, the American dream, that was, about the white picket fence. It's about the car in the driveway. It's about the suburbs, all those kinds of things. But, it's a whole different concept when you go into urban America. You go into Los Angeles, you go into New York, you go into Chicago. It's very different. People there, they don't even consider owning a home unless you move way out of the city. So it's a whole different concept, I think. But I think that, I think that we need to think much more comprehensively about the American dream. And I think we need to realize that, when we have a government that's broken, that really doesn't do a very good job of, securing democracy, that we have a lot to be concerned about, and so I think it's in jeopardy. I think that actually our governmental system, has already begun the process of being in what I would call systemic collapse. And that's certainly evident. And I've done lots of interviews on this, talked to people right, left, center, basically have, done surveys, of Americans, everyday people, and what they think. And, first of all, trust in government as an institution has declined substantially. And so we give up. And I don't want to see people give up. I want them to get in the face of their Congress representatives and others. We need to stay much more actively engaged in politics and not give up.
Just really quickly, is it also trust just in government, or is it trust in other institutions? Because I will tell you, as one that considers himself more spiritual than religious, one of the biggest things that I got frustrated by some people in the religious lane, and I know, Dan, you had talked about wanting to be a minister and everything, with this notion of prosperity ministry and everything. And I definitely got frustrated by a lot of institutions like that. It seems like they were too busy worrying about the finance of the church, and in some cases the leadership of the church, versus the greater community within the religious institutions and everything. So prosperity ministries, I sometimes have an issue with. I mean, some people may have an issue with liberation theology, which I am a fan of, which brings politics into religion as well. But I'm just wondering your take. Is it just government, or is it the institution?
No, it's faith in lots of institutions, and I think for some it's even faith in the family itself. Mm-hmm. You mentioned big church. Mm-hmm. Big. I mean, you look at the mega churches. I did a study probably 4 or 5 years ago on mega churches themselves, and I can't remember the head of the church in Texas who just resigned because of some pretty nasty allegations around his sexual relationships with a member of the congregation. But it's a reality. So, but I look at the church as very much it's a political force. The Christian right has come on very strong, but the Catholic Church has for years too. I mean, the Vatican has not really been an innocent bystander in anything in life. But the evangelical side of things it's an economic force. It's huge, and they've developed their own networks. And you think about business and networks of businesses and industry clusters. There's a whole infrastructure of businesses that basically are grounded in that cultural, religious milieu. Yes. It's huge. It's a force that still is very powerful. We're seeing some major changes take place in terms of, what we should and shouldn't see in schools in terms of religion. But I think that it's all part of the same thing, Mark. It's education. Look at where education is, higher education, all these, incredibly elite schools, under fire, in the last, not just the last 6 months, but they've been under fire for some time. But politics has become a blood sport. Mm-hmm. It really has. And, we've actually prided ourselves in our inability to compromise, or unwillingness to compromise. And I think that's a very dangerous position. My deepest wish is that people will not give up on government as an institution. I'm not an advocate for big government. As a matter of fact, in my book, there's a plan to actually, how do we reduce the federal debt? And that means a lot of different strategies. You reduce spending, you increase revenue sources, you do a mix of the two. But we've got to somehow figure out how to whittle down this $35 trillion debt that hangs over our head. And it's just not right.
We've been talking about that quite a bit on this network, because actually one of the shows we do is Economics Monday, and David Walker, who is a former comptroller general under several presidents, including 2 that were Republican and 1 Democrat, because I think he was under Obama, Bush, and I forgot the third one and everything, but he was definitely under a number of them. And he does a regular Monday afternoon show. It is the one that's at 12 o'clock, or maybe it's the one at 11 o'clock, but definitely it's a regular show that we have here on the network and everything. Hey, Mark, just out of curiosity, what has been your reaction just to what you've seen, because you are now what is considered an expatriate, so you're kind of watching things from afar and everything. And I'm sure that there are even people that are making comments to you, whether they be from France or Spain or some of the other people that you run across and everything. So, what is your take on things, and how are things perceived from our international friends and everything? Because we even have a gentleman on the network that's from Australia, and he sometimes brings a perception because he gets around doing a lot of trade work and commerce work in a number of places. But I was just wondering, from what your observation point there in south of France, whether you
it's very interesting to be in another place, and it's hard to defend what's going on in the U.S. I still vote, and I hope they get counted when I vote, but it's tough. It's embarrassing at times. It is. I try not to get into it. You can't help follow the politics, or at least I can't. You know, it's like a car wreck. You just keep glued to it. And I should be studying French more than I watch and listen to these all the news and what's going on. So it's a shame, because they really, you know, we are the beacon of democracy, and there's some people who are really freaking out, because I have British friends and French friends and Swiss. I mean, there's everybody is here, and Australian and stuff like that. But especially the British and the French are going, oh my God, what's going on over there? Because what happens there, they're afraid, is going to permeate. You know, you got the French elections, which are going to come up this coming Sunday for the second round. They're heading in a different direction. The British are voting, I think, tomorrow.
Yes. Yeah.
Having their own Independence Day. And so that's going to be a huge shift. And depends on what happens in November. And they're asking the question, which I think a lot of us are, if we haven't been, we're starting to. Are these really the two best people we can put up to run this country? And they laugh. I mean, they can't help it. It's really sad.
Yeah. You know, the same line, and I'd love to hear Jack's thoughts around that as well. The way I described the debate after the debate happened was, it reminded me, I was a fan and still am a fan, and I kind of alluded to that when you first came on, Mark, of old TV shows. So one of the old TV shows that I used to love watching, I haven't watched a recent rerun, but I used to love watching, partially because it's based in North Carolina, Mayberry and Andy Griffin and everything. So the parallel that I said was, it was like having Barney run against Otis, meaning that Biden would be the Barney character, and Otis was known for having a proclivity for not exactly telling a lot of truth and everything, so he would be the Trump character. So that's what I was making the parallel. It sounds like Barney versus Otis in that particular debate and everything. So I don't know if you agree with that parallel, but that's the parallel that I went with.
Well, that's not bad. But then imagine if you're over here trying to defend those choices.
Yeah.
To people.
But we have a major movement, and how long it lasts is not clear, but a move towards the right. You're seeing it in France, you're seeing it in Germany, you're seeing it in so many countries. You mentioned the UK. I have a lot of friends, and one of my editors for this book is from Vancouver, and they kind of look in shock at what's going on. It's just like, oh my God, this country is going to blow up, and we've had this relationship. We're so intimately tied to the United States. What's going to happen? And it is scary. But Mark Lee, to your point about, are these the two best candidates? That's a book that's a book in itself. I do talk about it in the book, and we've kind of resigned ourselves to two camps here. One is the career politician camp, which is Joe Biden, and anybody who replaces him, except some of the very young people. This total maverick, that doesn't even care about government, and he hasn't even taken it upon himself to understand it. He has a lot of smart people. Donald Trump has a lot of incredibly intelligent people helping him do what he does, and Joe Biden does as well. But so here we're at the point where I got a call this morning and said, "Well, what do you think is going to happen?" I don't know. I don't know. But I know that enough on the Democratic strategy side that there's two strategies that are going on simultaneously. And the question is, which one wins? Is it the strategy of, continuing with Joe Biden and trying to work it through and by somehow, do a good showing in the election and not take down too many other downstream politicians in Congress and governors and state houses? And the other one is deciding who would replace him and how you handle that whole strategy. But there's a third strategy that appeals to a lot of the conspiracy theorists, which is this is just all a game that the Democrats are playing as a way to grab attention away from the Republican convention and basically, cap things in their favor. That's kind of outlandish, but when you think of strategy, there is some sense to that. I can tell you that I read every day. I read the Washington Post, the New York Times. I read the Wall Street Journal. I occasionally take a peek at the Chicago Trib. I take a peek at the LA Times. I try to look around, see what's happening in Seattle and other places, just to get a different perspective of things. But you think we live in two different worlds when you look at the reporting that goes on. It's crazy. But we can do better, Mark Lee.
Yeah, we can definitely do better.
And don't give up. None of us can afford to give up, Continue to pursue your American dream. Continue to stay involved in some level of democracy saving and freedom fighting, because it's worth it. The alternative is not so good.
That makes a lot of sense. Just what's your take and everything, just in terms of where we are and everything, because you're there in Central, and that's actually one of those pivotal states, just like North Carolina is and everything. But I just wondering, what's your take on what you're seeing and what you're hearing from your friends and associates?
Go ahead. For me, I haven't followed politics or watched the news in probably 2 decades. But I will say, when it comes to politics and even kind of going backwards a little bit to the American dream, I think a lot of it has to do with cultural and societal changes. So looking at it kind of from a systemic perspective, because I was a systemic therapist, you look at the previous generations and everything was about community. It was, living in a neighborhood, close to people, connecting, things like that. And politics was kind of the same. It was more community based. What's best for the nation, right? Like John F. Kennedy asked not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Whereas now everything is very individualized. It's very individualistic. Look at me. It's all about me. Whether it's the left who's virtue signaling and we need to make these changes and I'm going to do these things because it makes me look good, or it's the right, these things don't need to be changed because they go against what I believe. Either way, it's very individualistic, and I think that loss of focus on community and connection is behind a lot of both the changing in what the American dream looks like, but also the political side of things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense and everything. I can definitely see that, and people can have that kind of view and all along those lines and everything. I was wondering, and this comes back to the mental health part of the conversation, because one of the things that the network has been talking about is this notion of what we're doing in education, and even the whole notion around social media and all along those lines. So I guess I'll start with Dan, because you teach a lot of people, and actually, ironically, I had a guest on that also teaches people from around the world, and she's of I think her background is Eastern European, but she's been on 2 of the shows, including one of the last online dinner parties and everything. But she teaches and has got a tremendous YouTube following, I think like 1 million views or something along those lines, and or 1 million subscribers or something in that space and everything. But I was just wondering, what are your thoughts just around what you're learning from the people that you're teaching? Because like I said, the young lady that I had on last time, and I'm trying to think of her name, but it's not coming to me and everything, but she was very much having success teaching people from around the world. And like I said, she is here in the U.S., but she originally was of Eastern European background and everything. So you can actually look her up, because you'll find her very active in those YouTube circuits and all along those lines. But what are some of the things that have surprised you about social media, and how much of social media are you even using with your own Chintan?
Well, social media is huge, both in the educational process and especially when you look at a business school. When you think about entrepreneurship and small businesses, I mean, this is one of the leading areas that we're seeing, the growth of new businesses and all the supporting services, the training companies that have been set up, to basically process social media data and feed it to AI. I mean, there's just an incredible surge of growth there. But, I think when you talk about education is central to the American dream, not by how many years of education or degrees you have, but, how well you are prepared to either build a business for yourself, to work in a organization and succeed, or to work on your own, as a freelancer and to be able to survive. But education today is really at a crossroad as well. You look at just the cost of college and university education, and there's more and more students who are questioning whether the payoff is there. And I think that the cost of higher education has grown exponentially. And there's a long set of things that explain that. But, there's a lot of pressures on education. You look at just the funding of education, the federal government's role, two different views. Joe Biden puts his stock in public schools and thinks that the federal government's money should be there primarily. Donald Trump says, we should go to vouchers, and any school, regardless of, what you do, should be eligible for federal funding. So there's two different views on that. But education is incredibly important. Online education has grown exponentially. I mean, we've seen in the last 2 years alone, 59 colleges and universities that have went down. 59. Most of them are private, but it's huge. It's absolutely huge. So technology needs to be a part of the future, even though I think, human presence and being in the classroom is so critical. I wouldn't be able to do what I do with students in Ghana, Malta, Dubai, and other places if we weren't doing this online. Okay. I mean, that's a reality, but I think that, I think we missed something in that process. There's something, I keep wondering about the three of you, and you're probably, wanting the same thing. What would it be like to, sit really in a room, at a dinner table, Mark?
Exactly. That's kind of the concept and everything.
But I'll bring the wine.
We bring the wine, bring the food, the whole 9 yards and everything. But Jack, just along those same lines and everything, what is your thoughts? Because so many of our kids are, and you were in that mental health space, are so engrossed in what's going on online. I've actually been out to eat sometimes too much in fast food restaurants and everything, and you will sometimes notice entire families and everybody's on their own device and everything, and not really involved in that community conversation that you were talking about was the more traditional one from decades ago and everything. So what is your take as a person that was in that mental health space and everything? Because I know even with one of my exes and everything, it was almost like pulling teeth. She had 2 daughters, and one of the daughters was very active in music, so she was very much wanting to go out. But the other daughter was very engaged in gaming and stuff like that, and it was almost like pulling teeth to get her to go outside of the building and everything. So I just wanted your on that and all along those lines.
So I definitely agree to some extent with Don. It has good qualities, right? I did telehealth for several clients because they couldn't leave their house, or they were too far to come to an office, and online education is huge. But overall, I think my view is that it's destroyed families, basically. So many couples I worked with, the problem with infidelity was they met somebody on social media. Kids, they get bullied at school, and then they come home and they're bullied. And then there's a separation from reality where they believe what they see online, as 100% fact. And I'll be scrolling through, and the amount of people that believe the earth is flat just absolutely blows my mind. And so I think I mentioned earlier where previous generations were more about community. humans in general, we thrive off of connection and relationships, and technology and social media and things like that has very much so removed that. And I'm not a fan of young kids in particular going to school online, because where else are they going to get that connection and learning to relate to people and make friends and things like that. So for me, I think it has its place for sure, right? I mean, virtual telehealth or virtual learning can certainly be a powerful thing. And even situations like this where people can come together and have conversations, I think it definitely has a place, but it should be kept within that place. It shouldn't be a person's life, and that shouldn't be where they search for that connection, right? The connection ultimately should be coming from people within their actual life, friends, family, romantic partners, whatever it is. That's where the focus should be primarily. So I always told couples and families, limit it to X amount of time per day. But if you're together, there needs to be time where you're actually together. So I think that's a big thing, is focusing more on the connection that's around you versus what you think is coming from, that virtual space.
That makes a lot of sense. Speaking of that virtual space, I can tell you that if I was to turn on the phone and all along those lines, that I will probably get tons of emails telling me about the AI girlfriend that I the ones that I don't have at the moment and everything, but they're constantly always trying to send you a letter. They've even given them names and everything along those lines. It definitely seems to be something that is a new big play, because every time I turn around, they are sending you new text telling you about Eva or Ava or whatever names they want to give them and everything. But there's all these virtual people. I'm going like, wait a minute. What if you want the real thing, which would be the better situation? But they are constantly trying to promote this idea that they are just as real as the as anything that you could want in life. Like, I don't think so. But
it was always interesting too, because like I would tell, whether it's an individual client or a family or a couple, I was like, just turn off your phone for a week. Don't turn it on at all for 1 week. And, anxiety was gone, depression was gone, the family was reconnecting. I don't think people realize just how much time they dedicate to not being active in a relationship when they're on their phone, right? And every other second there's a ding or the phone's ringing or you're getting some notification. And it's over stimulating most of the time. And so if you can just turn it off for, a few hours, that cuts down a lot of the anxiety and stress that we feel, just because it gives us a moment to just be and not so focused on what's coming next.
That makes a lot of sense. Hey, Mark, and we got about another 15, 20 minutes to go before we wrap everything up and everything along those lines. What advice would you give to people, speaking of connections, that are going through the notion of taking care of a elderly relative? Because you went through it more recently than Dan did and everything. So what advice would you give? Because I know, as I mentioned, that I had a aunt that passed and actually an aunt and two uncles that passed and one aunt that passed, and all along those lines, and all in that space. Actually, it might have been three uncles now that I think about it and everything. But what advice would you give to folks that are dealing with their loss in family? Because that's something you just recently dealt with and you put it in your book. So what advice would you give into how to deal with that very painful transition that people have to go through?
Well, again, I guess be open and with open heart and a good attitude. Empathy is a huge part of it, because you have to put yourself in their shoes. They're no longer the young, let's say, spry person that you knew. They're still your loved one, or even if it happens to be a stranger, they're going to be a little slower. They may not make sense all the time. Not to bring up the debate, but they are still a person that deserves dignity and respect. And I mean, and the connection is huge. There's these studies on these blue zones around the world, and it's not just about good food and good air and things like that. It's the social connection that these people have within their community, not just their family, but their community. And people in the situation like with my mom, she missed that connection. That's why she wanted to check out. Once love was returned to her room and in her home and in her life, she wanted to live, I guess, come back and live. And she lived another 3.5 years. So that is very important. But also, for any advice for people jumping in, doing this 24/7, the stress and the mental toll and the physical toll on you is tremendous. And I have to tell you, with Jack being a guy, I went into it. I'm a guy. I can handle all this stuff. And with my mom, I not only wanted to return dignity to her, I wanted to return dignity to her surroundings. So I rebuilt her house because she slept a lot during the day, like a baby. So I renovated her house. So the first thing I did was the basement, and I put a man cave in there with a rowing machine and kettlebells and things like that, because I knew I needed stress relief. But still, I went through a situation where I had 3 emergency surgeries during our time together, and Mom almost outlived me.
Wow.
And there's a very high percentage, I think it's over 30% of the caregivers die before their patient or their loved ones. And so take the breaks. The pros say you got to take the breaks. And I resisted it, and it almost cost me. So that's the main thing. Have empathy for your loved one. They're going to be a little slower. Have patience. If you can infuse some humor into the whole situation, that's great. And take breaks, because you need to be healthy so you can take care of them.
Yeah, speaking of taking breaks and all along those lines and everything, how important this is for everybody do you think it is? Because one of the things that I admire about certain cultures, including some of the African and Asian cultures, is that they are very connected, not just to their multiple generations, but also to their ancestors. Some people call it ancestor worship, but I just think it's important to be connected to your ancestors. I mean, my grandmother's been gone for 40 years, because it was 82, or more than 40 years, because it was 82 that she passed away. But I still feel that some of the lessons that I learned from her and her creativity and all along those lines, I still carry to this day, even though Grandma Molly has been gone for multiple decades. And there were even friends of mine. Ironically, we were talking about dance earlier. One of them is a major dance pioneer here in Durham. I think it's been 6 years since Papa Chuck Davis passed and everything, but I still remember our conversations and still think of him as an ancestor, but not a family ancestor, because ancestors don't always have to be in your own family circle and everything. But I still remember those lessons that we taught each other and all along those lines. So how important do you think it is for there to be that ancestral connection? Because that's one of the things that I admire about some of the African nations, as well as some of the Asian nations. So I was just wondering y'all's take on that.
Well, I think it's very important. I worked over a long period of time on my family history, and a lot of that was rolled into my personal memoir that was published last year. But I think you get a greater sense of connectivity. I think Jack, you used that word, that goes beyond just today, but it brings history to life. I mean, when you really, there's no such thing as family history without looking at the history of the times, whether it was the local place you grew up. I have a good friend down in Tuskegee, Alabama. His name is Lloyd Williams, and Lloyd, his family probably went through everything that you could imagine in terms of, everything that took place in the South, his family, grandparents, the founding of Tuskegee University. But if you looked at Lloyd just in today's world, you'd say, well, this is just a guy. He's an African-American guy. He's very talented. He teaches, he does this, he writes. But my God, his real story is buried in his ancestry. Mm-hmm. It's huge. And that's the interesting story. And by the way, Mark Lee, that's a guy you should talk to. Lloyd Williams is a guy you would enjoy interviewing.
Yeah, I would love having a conversation with him, because it sounds like we have some parallels. Because actually, I was talking to a friend of mine that's going to be doing a possible conversation around my grandfather, because the biology building at North Carolina Central is actually named after him, and he did some early biology work, and his wife, my grandmother, and everything actually founded the first African-American library in Raleigh and everything. And then my parents followed up with that by starting a rural radio station that was not connected to a university, because most kind of like the PBS type stations, NPR type stations,
Yeah.
a lot of times they are connected to universities. There are not many of them. There are a few select few that are like more community based, but if they are part of the bigger chain, not so much the community based radio, but kind of like the more traditional NPR. Most of them, if they are on a certain trajectory, they are connected to colleges. Not saying that they all are, but quite a few of them are. So they were pioneers
Absolutely.
in that sense and all along those lines. So that's part of my own family legacy. So we definitely will have to have that conversation. Before we wrap up, I did have one other question for Mark and everything, because it's come up in some other conversations. It even comes down to this notion of political correctness and everything. Because I've got some friends that are stand-up comedians. Some of them are jokes that are some people consider to be insulting to certain groups, and some of them are very careful to avoid those kind of jokes and everything. We know Chris Rock and others have made a whole living off of what they have said and everything. So I'm just wondering your take on how much should there be political correctness in comedy? And I am a big fan of comedy and even a big fan of the improv as well. But I was just wondering, when you were doing stand-up and even teaching stand-up, how much did that play into your conversation?
Well, my stuff was pretty clean and all pretty much personal stuff. So I never had to deal with that. But yeah, I mean, you got to gear it towards your audience. But I wouldn't filter anybody. We have a choice whether you want to see them or not see them. So they have to do what they do, and what they do is best. So if it's controversial and that's the way they are, so that's fine. People got to I guess, do their own thing. So you have people like, let's say, Seinfeld, who's very politically correct, though I just saw a clip recently where he was being hassled, I think, because of his stand on Israel. And he handled it very well. It was very interesting with the protesters. So there are people who will do that, or other people who will attack. So, I can't tell anybody how they do it. They've got to be real. They can't put on an act. They've got to be true to themselves. And if they offend people, then people can turn the channel or not go to the show.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know a lot of people that back in the day were offended by Andrew Dice Clay because he would say some very controversial things along those lines. But like you said, if they were fans of his, then they were fans of his. And there were a number of others. Even some people weren't the biggest fans of Richard Pryor because he would say some very controversial things as well when he was living. But like you said, you've got the choice to go with what they say or not say. It is interesting kind of watching to some of our conversations today around politics, with watching the trajectory, because some people are wondering as to how Bill Maher started and where Bill Maher is now and everything, because a lot of people are having a fun time with that because they remember Bill Maher, I guess, when he first came out as being fairly super liberal, and now it seems like he's moving more towards the conservative side of politics, according to some and everything. But it's just interesting watching that trajectory. Well, don't know if y'all had seen that as well, and if y'all had noticed a shift. And he's not the only one that shifted. I've seen shifts from right to left and left to right in different comedians based on what's going on in their own views and some of their own changing views, because we are always constantly evolving as humans. I don't know that I have the same views now that I had when I was at Marquette in the 80s on certain things, but some things have been very much like-minded, and there are other things that I might have changed my mind about. I'll even give an example. I don't know, at the time that I was at Marquette, that I was the biggest fan of Enterprise Zones, which is a Nixon kind of initiative and everything.
Yeah.
But as I have grown and learned more about it, it seems like it is a reasonable way to develop things in the urban community. So I've become maybe not a total fan, but a bigger fan than I probably was when I was at Marquette and all along those lines. So I can understand where people might have a affinity for that kind of planning and everything. So yeah, we all change and all in that space. Well, this has been
Here's an idea for you, Mark. You asked about political correctness. Maybe Congress and the White House would be happier places and more productive if they had court jesters.
that could be
I
a
got to
good
tell
idea.
you, it is amazing what humor can do.
Yeah.
I think of my relatives, my Uncle Ed, who spent most of his life in Houston. This guy, he could draw an audience in to tell a story and a joke like nobody I've ever seen. He was a magnet. But I keep thinking, maybe some levity would be healing to what goes on in Washington.
Yeah.
Some levity would be good. I've seen a couple of times people have tried to tell jokes, and maybe they need somebody like a Mark to help them learn the skill and everything. Because I've seen some people try to tell jokes even during the debate, and sometimes the jokes seem to fall flat. Because I saw
Yeah.
in the last debate, I saw both that whole golf thing and a couple of other things. I saw both Trump and Biden attempt to do jokes. I'm going like, yeah, that joke's not quite working. So
No.
maybe they need some joke training and everything because it was delivered kind of flat, even though they were trying to deliver the joke. But yeah, you got to have some training in how to do it. And I also don't know that people, and I don't know if everybody's going to agree with me, but there are two forms of humor that I am a big fan of. I've been a big fan ever since they were out in the 70s and 80s. And I see politicians and others try to use them, but I think you have to understand the word satire and sarcasm before you can actually use it and everything. So I think some people think that they're being satirical or being sarcastic, and they're misusing those terms because they're not doing it in a correct format. They're kind of being attacking versus the actual ways that those things are supposed to be used.
Very true. Very true.
One of the things I always worked with clients about was if you're triggered or upset by something somebody did or says, it says a lot more about you than it does them, right? Those are things that you need to work on versus them, changing themselves, because nobody else is really responsible for your emotional reactions. That's something that solely falls on you. And I think the political correctness really stifles a lot of creativity, right? Everybody has to walk on eggshells and become responsible for other people's emotional states and other people's thoughts and things like that. So, that's one area that I definitely think the political correctness should be kind of thrown to the side a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that and everything because it's not just political correctness in terms of politics as well. Because I've had some friends of mine, because one of the big things that I'm big on is the notion of saying no. And sometimes even though it's a simple 2-letter word, sometimes we have a hard time saying no and all along those lines. And sometimes I've had people that have approached me about doing things and getting involved in various projects, and then they sometimes wonder why the people are constantly saying no to them and going along those lines, and not realizing that if they keep getting, it's kind of like that notion, if you keep getting the same results, and kind of like what I was talking about earlier in dating and everything, it might not be them, it might be you that is the common thread that is going into all the discussion. So to your point, Jack, you might need to do some internal examinations. I've had some friends of mine that I'm sitting there, they're going like, well, those people are upsetting me and they're not doing this and they're not doing that. And I'm going like, well, who's the central character in these various narrations and everything? It's you that's the central character. So maybe you need to examine yourself versus examining why they are doing all the incorrect things. But I don't know that we do enough of that,
Well, and like I said earlier, most people are so focused on themselves that in reality they don't care what you're doing, or they're not out plotting against you. They're way too focused on their own life and what they have going on.
Yeah. Just really quickly, there's 2 quick questions, and then we'll wrap the whole show, because there's two questions I ask everybody. Before I get to the questions I ask everybody, one of them is about what y'all's books there and everything are. What would your answer be to those that I mentioned, that word of no? And I know a lot of people have a hard time. It's only 2 letters. But a lot of times people have a hard time saying no. So what advice do you give to people that are having a hard time saying no? Because I kind of even mentioned that with you, Mark, earlier, where I'm sure that there were people that were trying to discourage you and everything, and you just probably had to go ahead and not listen to them and go ahead and use that no word. And there probably even been assignments that you decided not to go for, even in terms of your acting career, where you literally had to say no. So how did you get the strength to say no? Because a lot of times people will get a little antsy about saying no, afraid of what the reaction is going to be and everything. So how did you get confident with you being able to say no, whether it was for an assignment or whether it was for life or whatever it was?
Well, I for me, it was like, well, especially as an actor, you have to, usually you want to do anything, any work you can get, you take, but you get to a point where you just say, no, this isn't right for me. I've got to live with this thing. So no is easy. And also no is very powerful. Mm-hmm. Sometimes the no will get, these people will wake right up. What do you mean no? How can you possibly say no to whatever it is in any situation? So I just say, yeah, I got to live with myself. So
That makes sense.
it's not hard. Maybe that first one was difficult, but it's not hard.
What about you, Jack? I'm sure there was even clients that you had to turn down because they were not a good fit and everything. So how did you get comfortable with saying no? Because not every mental health patient is for every mental health practitioner.
Yeah. So I think no in and of itself is very liberating. And I think the most freeing realization I had and something I passed on to a lot of clients is that no is a one-word sentence. There's no need for explanation or defending yourself. If no is the answer, then no is the answer. Fortunately, if somebody's reaching out for mental health help, number one, I had a list of referrals that I would send them, and if the answer was no, they generally didn't fight back on that. They would just reach out to one of the referrals or something else. But yeah, I mean, like Mark said, it comes down to what's best for you. And it's a one-word sentence. You don't have to explain it to anybody.
Hey, Dan, along those same lines, I'm sure that when you were going back in time telling your parents that you did not want to be a minister, they were probably kind of going against that notion and everything, but you had to tell them no and all along those lines. So how have you had the strength to say no, even saying no to your own parents and everything? And sometimes that can be the most difficult no.
Well, in all honesty, Mark, I had to get away from him. This was done through a phone call from Tucson, Arizona to St. Clairsville, Ohio. So it was a lot easier, even though my mom was crying and my dad was angry with me for turning down a scholarship and all that kind of stuff. But, the older I have become, the easier it is for me to actually avoid the whole issue of no. And part of it is, I don't want to feel like I can't help somebody, but at the same time, I don't want to feel like I should be doing things that I shouldn't be doing, Mm-hmm. But I've learned to kind of buffer my words a little bit more. And it took a lot of work, both writing the memoir and writing this book, America's Dream, to really find a voice of moderation, more of a voice of acceptance, but allowing people to, you put your stuff out there, but allowing them to find their own place. It's just like the discussion we were having about political correctness. I would agree that, people need to be who they are. That's what they're going to be best at. But I try to anticipate people. I've had people that I've had to say no to. I had to turn down a student who wanted me to write a co-author an article with him, but I was just too busy. And I felt badly because we had a wonderful relationship and I didn't want him to misunderstand and, feel like, well, I was letting him down by not doing this. But I just said, look, I'm really overworked. Give me 6 months, maybe. Yeah. I'm tired of the whole toughness thing. I gotta tell you, I'm tired of it. I don't like being tough anymore.
That makes a lot of sense, and no can lead to maybes and yes, and all along those lines. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. The questions I asked everybody, and I'll start with the first guest that I had, which was the other Mark and everything. And it's actually a two-pronged question that will go round robin and wrap up everything in that space. But one of the things that the network is, it is a global network, meaning Pod TV, meaning that there are guests from around the world, and there are also producers and listeners from around the world as well. I think that I've heard them estimate somewhere like 175 to 200 countries, depending on what shows it is and what time it is and a variety of other factors and everything. But one of the things that I like to do, and call it my own ministry for lack of a better term and everything, is to give people a chance with all the negativity that is going on to spin it and to give a message of positivity. So going back to your thought around, Dan, around mindfulness, that's something I've done for now almost 2 or 3 years. So every guest has given their own thoughts as to a message of positivity. So if Mark, if you will share how people can reach you, any other things that you haven't got to, and your message of positivity, then I'll go to Jack and close out with Dan. But definitely that's the question I get everybody to answer when I am ending the show. So.
If anybody is interested in the book or any of the, if they Google A Cup of Tea on the Commode, we're everywhere. I've got a YouTube channel with a lot of fun teasers. The website is A Cup of Tea. on the commode.org, the Facebook page, the same. If they Google that, they'll see everything. It's on, of course, Amazon and paperback, large print, ebook, and also audiobook. And it looks like this.
Nice.
And I would say my positivity statement I mentioned earlier is find the joy. And it's not only find the joy for yourself, if you can make someone else happy, make them smile in a day, it's a good feeling, and hopefully it's contagious. So if you make someone else happy, I'll tell you a quick story. So when I was visiting a friend's design firm in LA, and there was about maybe 30 people in this firm, and one day this angry woman burst through the door screaming. Now, apparently I didn't find this out until later. She was a neighbor, and because there were so many people and it was in a neighborhood, the office was on Beverly Boulevard, but it was the guys parked in the neighborhood. And a lot of times, apparently somebody parked in front of this woman's driveway and blocked her in many times. So she came in raging. And I happened to be standing there in front of a box of chocolates. And I saw this lady raging, and most of the people from the company just scattered. It was like they just didn't want to deal with this woman. And I looked at her and I said, I got to change this. So I said, Madam, would you like a piece of chocolate? Mm-hmm. And she said, her mood completely changed. She said, no, thank you. It sounds very nice, but I need to watch my weight. And I said, lady, I'm looking at you and you're doing just fine. And I handed her a piece of chocolate. And that lady floated out of that office on a cloud. And then once she left, the other people started coming back into the office. And I said, that's how you have to handle that situation. You guys, first of all, do not park in front of her driveway again. You're the problem. And that's how you solve that problem. Mm-hmm. And I did it kind of as a joke at first. I had chocolate and I said, I got to change it. But it was a really good lesson for me. And I think the people who were in the office that day. So that lady she was happy, and hopefully her driveway didn't get blocked anymore. But
hopefully didn't get blocked anymore. Before I get to Jack and Dan as well, I do have to ask you, because it's been on my mind now for a minute. When you moved to France, did you have to change the title to A Cup of Tea on the Benet? Because I do know that in certain parts of the world it's not necessary.
Yeah, I'm going to have to, I am translating it. In French would probably be the first language. And yeah, the title will have to change, because a commode in French is a chest of drawers. So it makes no sense. And toilette or bidet, I don't think makes sense. So I'll have to come up with something. So that's okay. That's my challenge.
Yeah, that'll be a challenge to see how it goes into the translation space. Jack, if you want to share your own message of positivity and how folks can reach you, and anything that we didn't get to that you want to get to as well.
Yeah. So I can be reached at Jack Lawrence Writing, WRITING.com. Social media platforms, Facebook or Instagram. And my books can be purchased anywhere that you buy books. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Walmart, your favorite independent bookstore, which I always encourage. And I would say that my message is that time is the biggest commodity that you have, or the most precious commodity that you have. And so think very hard about where you want to invest that time, because it's one of those things where once it's gone, it's gone, right? You can earn money, you can meet new people, but you really never get the time back. And so wherever you want to invest that time, put as much into it as you can, because that's going to be your biggest commodity that you have.
That makes a lot of sense. Before I get to Dan, just really quickly, because you did kind of mention it, and I did have some friends that were in that space, including some that are no longer in that space. But since independent bookstores do have a hard time and all along those lines, what word of advice can you give, and a reason that we should go more to independent bookstores, Jack? Because I am a fan of those. We have a major one here in Durham called The Regulator, and I regret that the No Bookstore isn't around, which was an African-American bookstore and everything. But I just wanted if you can just share a little bit as to why you think independent bookstores are important. And I do agree with you that they are important.
Yeah. So number one, I mean, they really skyrocketed my career once the independent bookstores started picking it up. everybody else start picking my books up. But also they're people of your community, right? And they're trying to maintain this business, and they really do care about you, right? If you get a damaged book, they're going to go out of their way to try to help you. They're going to get to know you and have conversations with you, and they're going to be able to make recommendations to you that are spot on versus Amazon, right? It's kind of based on your search history or things that you've bought in the past, and maybe you hated it, and now they're recommending a bunch of stuff that you didn't finish. So that's the biggest thing, is there are people in your community trying to make a living, and they're going to take the time to get to know you and make suggestions that are going to be great fits.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Dan, as we get ready to wrap everything up with you and everything, if you tell folks how you can be reached and contacted, your words of wisdom in terms of a message of positivity also, and I may have a last follow-up question for you, and then we'll go out with these commercials.
Sure. Happy to do that. So my website is donaldyanone.com, DonaldIannone.com. And this is for Mark Steven. It's a book of poetry I wrote about a year ago. It's called Box of Chocolates, Assorted Poems for Assorted Times.
We didn't rehearse this.
I just had this sitting here, and I thought, oh my God.
That's funny. Well, that's why we're together on this show.
Yeah. So, this is a real book, and I think that what it says is that the main character is the American dream, and it's not the candidates for the presidency. So I urge people to read it. So far, the reviews have been very positive. Lots of interviews, which I'm pleased to have opportunities just to talk about the book. But every day I post something positive. I post a wisdom quote, a daily reflection every day. It's not a day, and it goes on all my social media sites, from Facebook to Instagram to LinkedIn. I put it on the business networking website as well. But it's part of my daily discipline, showing up in the morning and basically, taking stock of myself and finding something very simple that I can do in no more than 10 minutes and get it out there. So that's how I contribute to kind of a positive environment in the world that I can reach. And to me, it comes from in here because it's something that I need.
That makes a lot of sense.
And my wife just stuck her head in and said, tell them that the book will be available on July 8th.
Good work from the wife to let you know that it'll be available on July 8th, which is only 5 days from now and everything. So it will be available at that particular time and everything. One of the things, and this will be my last question to you and everything, and I'm just curious your take on this, Don, and everything, because we have had guests of different ethnicities and different backgrounds and everything. And I remember growing up, it might have been, as an adult watching, I think it was one of our famous anchors. It might have been either Dan Rathers or Ted Koppel, one of those. And they were looking at the world religions. And one of the things that I found that very interesting was that the common theme was that whether it was Eastern religions or Western religions, that there's a lot of extremism that exists in religions, but the common themes are very much similar. That was kind of the point of this particular documentary and everything. So I was just wondering your thoughts on that, and also your thoughts on any messages you would have to people that might not be of the same faith as you and everything. Because like I said, I'm always interested to talk to people of varying faiths. Consider myself probably more Christian aligned than anything else, but definitely consider myself more spiritual, if I'm going to be perfectly honest, and everything. But definitely have friends that are Islamic and Buddhist and a number of other things as well. So I just wonder your thoughts, because when I saw that special, I think my dad actually brought me to see that special and everything. It was very much seeing that there was a lot of similarities in terms of like respect nature, respect to your parents, and a lot of other things. Didn't matter whether you were Muslim, Christian, Buddhist, even some of the same principles could even go with the agnostics and some of the other people that are not necessarily on a faith walk and everything.
Well, I think the number one thing is to just get beyond ourselves, to be able to see beyond our own ideas, our own beliefs, to connect to something that's larger, if that's the Christian faith, if that's Islam, if it's Buddhism. It's just the ability to get beyond ourselves and to see that there is this amazing world, that surrounds us, and that it's open to us, and all we have to do is open to the world. But I see that. I mean, there's been a lot that's been written and said about religion. And Mark Lee, you asked earlier about, people's confidence in that as an institution. I think it's taken so many new forms. I'm excited about what I see happening, mostly along the path of spirituality, less in terms of organized religion. But I think just seeing that there's so much more beyond each of us. That's it.
Definitely agree with you on that. We'll go out with this commercial that actually was from a gentleman, I believe, in Oklahoma, and he was honoring a group of folks that all three of you, and I guess to some degree I am part of as well, but he has created an award, and this is actually from a few years ago, where he was honoring not just the teachers, but also the teacher support group and all along those lines. So he actually created it before the pandemic. So he was honoring like the guidance counselors, the principals, but also honoring like the janitors and a number of other people that it takes to run a school system. So he created this award. I think it was back in 2000. It'll come up on the commercial. I think it was 2016 or something like that. So it's actually been going on for a number of years. And that's something that I think that we need to do on a regular basis, is acknowledge the great work that our teachers do and give them the support that they need, and all along those lines. Because I'm one of those people that don't think that they get paid, as one that's had family members in that field, nearly enough for what they do in our society, and all along those lines. So on that note, we'll go out with this particular commercial, but it's been a fun conversation, and look forward to hopefully having y'all on another online dinner party. And who knows, next time I'll bring some of the fair sex as well. So this time it was an all male dinner party, but sometimes it's been dinner parties, it's been me and a couple of ladies, and sometimes it's been even where I've dropped off and the ladies have taken over and everything. And then we've had some dinner parties that have been a mixture and all along those lines. But it's always fun. It's usually somewhere between 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 at the max, but it's always a fun conversation. Hopefully I can get you back on another edition of the dinner party, all three of you gentlemen, at a later date. But right now we're going to get out on this edition on July 3rd. But it's been a fun conversation, and I hope you all enjoyed it as well.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Enjoyed the time together with all of you. Yeah.
I won't fold, I won't drop until we on top. Only going non-stop, non-stop. I won't fold, I won't drop until we on top. Only going non-stop.
I want to thank everyone for coming to the 2020 TAF Awards. This was a show like no other, people. This is the Grammys for dignitaries, educators, and support staff around the state of Oklahoma and worldwide. We cannot do this without the support of the people. So we thank you, I thank you, for being such a dedicated supporter to this movement for the Teachers Appreciation Foundation. I thank you.
It's non-stop, I won't fold, I won't drop until we on top. Only going non-stop.
Are you looking for money-saving strategies for your business and personal finances? Are you tired of working hard every day with little or nothing to show for it? Contact Prosperity Financial Services, LLC right now for your free financial consultation. Call now to reserve yours today. 804-349-8600. 804-349-8600.